Welcome to our May 12th webinar on the revitalization of nuclear for energy. Most of us in our lifetime have experienced the roller coaster ride of promises, problems with nuclear. Since World War II, nuclear has meant for the general public the atomic bomb, threats of annihilation and radioactivity. Think 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. But nuclear for energy has meant so much more. A virtually inexhaustible source of energy, valued today for its low GHG emissions, but suspect for the high cost of production, lengthy construction overruns, issues of security, and how to dispose of radioactive waste. But that was then, and this is now. Nuclear social license is apparently being restored. Think Europe. And well, let's hear from each of our distinguished presenters, their views. Rob Norris will be our moderator today, so over to you, Rob. And Rob, please share with us a little bit of your background in energy.
Great, thanks very much. And I'm just honored to be here with such an august group, and especially on such a relevant and urgent topic. I grew up in Red Deer and moved to Saskatchewan in the mid 1990s for what I thought was going to be a year of school, and really it opened my eyes to the significance of Canada's position and standing in the world as it relates to uranium resources, and then obviously part of that value chain when we look to provinces, traditionally Ontario or New Brunswick, about power generation. I had the privilege of serving in Brad Wall's government as the Minister of Advanced Education, Employment, Labor, Immigration, Innovation, and SAS Power. It was those last two responsibilities that allowed me to work with our Premier and work with stakeholders from across the province and across the country, some of whom are on this call, as we put in place a nuclear research strategy that came out of direct feedback. And when we think about the prairies, for example, we can think about value-added agriculture and how significant that is. What we noticed is that wasn't the tone or the approach when it came to uranium. And we wanted to play a role in helping to ensure that there was a greater dialogue on that value chain and what that meant for Canadians, and certainly what it meant within the context of Saskatchewan. So I'm delighted to be here. I guess I would offer just a couple of things. Robert Zoellick has many of you will know, he's the former president of the World Bank. He's recently just come out with a new article, Before the Next Shock. It's in Foreign Affairs of March and April 2022. And essentially he says, the world is in the early stages of a vast and likely discontinuous energy transition that will match the Industrial Revolution in its hard to anticipate effects. And Steve Polis has just come out, former governor of the Bank of Canada, and said essentially a lot of this transition is going to require political engagement and depend on political decisions. And so part of what we're talking about is technology, but part of it is public policy, and a lot of it is going to be determined through perceptions, communications, and engagement. And it speaks to some of that legacy, Barry, that you brought forward. Today, obviously, we've got really rare, terrific speakers to offer, I think, to illuminate some key features. And so without further ado, Morgan, if we could ask you to draw on your expertise in nuclear systems, nuclear safety, and to really help provide a bit of an overview for where the sector is today.
So thank you very much. I'd like to talk today a very brief introduction to Canada's nuclear story. And that's me. I'm a research engineer and also involved with a couple of other nuclear organizations in Canada. I've been doing nuclear stuff for some 33 years. So climate and greenhouse gases, it's time to step up. That's our electric car. You can see the prices down there for what it takes to fill it up. And we just love it. And electric cars are really going to be something of the future, and they are part of the present. But we want to increase the electrification. How do we do it? There's no easy solutions. The best hydro sites have already been developed. More remote sites are being built. Wind and solar, they're cheap to build, but they have low capacity factors. They're useful, but they're capricious, and building more doesn't fill the gap. Wind and solar need large scale storage. There's a very large facility in China, which would store about 5.5 minutes of Alberta's production. Solar has its place, but it has a capacity factor in the order of 18%. You can see it changes from winter to summer. And the bottom two graphs show actually hour of the day charts. And there are large error bars on them, or as the amount of production changes over the days that you can't count on it, in other words. Wind has its place, definitely. But again, you can see seasonal variation, and the bottom one shows the sort of hour by hour variation over 72 hours. This is all Ontario data. And you can see it's very difficult for grids to cope with such variability. So what about nuclear? Well, since 1962, 25 Canadian CANDU reactors have produced 3.5 billion megawatts net, and that's about 5.5 years of Canadian electrical production and virtually no greenhouse gases. 19 of those CANDUs are currently in operation or are being refurbished. Their capacity factor is around 80%. So that's, continuous baseload operation, and they go out every now and then for scheduled maintenance outages. And that 3.5 billion megawatts hours, if it was from coal, which was the main alternative, it would have produced in the order of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2. That's around 4 years worth of our entire country's CO2 production. Coal also produces a great deal of ash and particulates, all sorts of other wastes. And another 1.1 billion megawatt hours to date have been produced by 12 CANDUs, which have been built internationally. And that's not including 18 variants of that in India. So I'm unashamedly proud of the CANDU reactor. And it was one of the top 10 engineering achievements of the past century. And I'd like to emphasize, we are not a sunset industry. And thinking of that, here's a graph to show you. The pink line was produced in 2003 by Campaign for Nuclear Phase Out, who obviously don't like nuclear. And yet in the gray to the right, you can see that's the difference between their predictions and what was actually produced in Canada by nuclear reactors. So we're not quite dead yet. Now, I always like to go back and show a little bit of Canadian nuclear history. So we start with Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealander, who came in 1898 to McGill University and described radioactivity and half-life, and he won the Nobel Prize for this. He won it in 1908 when he was actually now a professor in Britain, so they claimed the prize. But in 1930, this man, Gilbert Labine, and his brother Charles, discovered uranium and started mining it up in the Northwest Territories. And at that time, it had no purpose really other than extracting the small amounts of radium from within the uranium and using it for treating cancer. And they built a Port Hope refinery where they did their processing. That's a picture of now with uranium mining in Canada. That's Cigar Lake in northern Saskatchewan. Is the highest grade ore in the world. And just yesterday I read that their output planned for this year will be the largest single operation in the world of a mine. And Canada typically produces somewhere between 1/7 and 1/5 of the world's supply of uranium. Scrolling on now to 1939, in the middle there, you have Otto Hahn in his laboratory in Berlin. He was a exceedingly talented chemist. He bombarded uranium and he had these unusual chemical results. So he sent his work off to Lise Meitner, who's also shown in that picture. She was a refugee scientist in Stockholm at the time, having escaped Nazi Germany. And she looked at it with her nephew, Otto Frisch, and they realized what was happening. Somehow, uranium was being split apart and a tremendous amount of energy was being released with it. So she and Otto wrote to the journal Nature in February 1939, and it's, announcing fission to the world. This was great news. Physicists all over the world got very excited about this, started to do these experiments, started to trade notes, and then war came along. That cut off all the communication. In Canada, one of the people working on that early use of uranium was this fellow, George Lawrence from Charlottetown originally. He was working at the National Research Council in Ottawa, and he did the first large-scale experiments with uranium in the world. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, a committee there concluded that atomic weapons were feasible. And there were several European refugee scientists who had escaped from France, and they'd ended up in Cambridge, carrying on their research there with British scientists. And the UK at the time was the leader in the world of knowledge about radiation and uranium. After the Pearl Harbor attack, the US moved very quickly with their Manhattan Project and soon overtook the UK in terms of knowledge. And the UK and the USA proposed to move the UK project from Britain to Canada with the National Research Council to support them. And they set up the Montreal Laboratories, thanks to this guy saying, okay, let's go. And the Montreal Laboratories, founded with these European, British, and now Canadian scientists, it evolved eventually into the Chalk River Laboratories within a couple of years. And that's where I work now. South of the border at the time, another refugee scientist, Enrico Fermi, he and his team built the world's first nuclear reactor. It was moderated with graphite. But Canada's focus was on heavy water, and it was known to be the best moderator in theory back in 1939. And in fact, the US persuaded Cominco to build a heavy water or D2O production facility actually under the noses of the Canadian government. They didn't realize about it. The Americans built a reactor. They were called piles back then. And it was the first one in the world with heavy water and natural uranium. They didn't need any enrichment. And it first operated in 1944. But by that point, the Americans had graphite reactors that were already producing plutonium. And so they said, fine, let the Canadians work with heavy water. And that led to Zero Energy Experimental Pile, the first reactor outside the United States built at Chalk River. It took about a year to design and build. And that fellow in the bottom right corner, Lou Kowarski, he was one of these refugee scientists, and he was the lead physicist behind the design of this. George Klein from the National Research Council was very much involved. He did the mechanical design of the reactor. Very successful scientific tool, which lasted until 1970, doing great service. So in 1945, Canada had the second largest nuclear infrastructure on the planet. ZEEP Works, the world's most powerful research reactor, NRX, was already under construction. It took another couple of years before it first operated. We were world experts on heavy water, and we had uranium. From those early beginnings, AECL, as the Chalk River Laboratories eventually became, they had 3 large research reactors built over the years. They're all shut down now. The first 2, NRX and NRU at Chalk River, and WR1 at the Manitoba, the Whiteshell Laboratories in Manitoba. Now this fellow, Wilfred Bennett Lewis, he came in 1946 as the head of R&D at AECL, and he was the driving force behind applying this new nuclear science to electricity production. And The Canadian program built on its expertise, natural uranium and heavy water. In 1962, this was the result. The NPD, or Nuclear Power Demonstration Reactor, worked very successfully for 25 years. It was small, but it not only was a prototype, it also was a research reactor. And you can see in front of that picture, it looks like a school. There's a large training center there. NPD led to another 24 power reactors in Canada. They're CANDU design. And of these 25, 19 are still in operation or are being refurbished at present. It also led to another 12 reactors around the world, 12 CANDUs, of which most of them are still in operation. And so what's the current status of nuclear power generation? Well, the company Ontario Power Generation, which took over from Ontario Hydro in the 1990s, they are refurbishing the 4 units at Darlington, and they are on budget and on time. One of the units is completed and is up and running again. Their final shutdown is planned for 2055. Their Pickering units, which were the first big station in Canada, they're not planning to refurbish, and shutdown is planned in a couple of years. Bruce Power leased a site from OPG with 8 reactors. They restarted 2 units, they refurbished another 2, and they're now refurbishing 6 of them. And one of them is already in the process now. Again, on budget, on time. These are huge projects, and their final shutdown is planned for 2064. New Brunswick Power has one large CANDU. It was refurbished in 2012, and they expect to have 30 to 35 years life out of it. Now, small modular reactors will be covered by Bob, so I'll just give a brief overview. There are 10+2 design reviews underway with our regulator, Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. The federal government is very much in favor of SMRs, as they're called. There's an action plan, you can read it online. OPG is planning to build a unit, and Saskatchewan may follow suit with the same design. New Brunswick Power is working with a couple of vendors, and a prototype, a small one, is planned for Chalk River. It's a 5 megawatt reactor. There's an enlargement of the reactor core itself, and it uses some fabulous, I was going to say new fuel. It's certainly new to Canada. It's a very robust fuel, behaves absolutely superbly, even under the worst conditions. Talking about waste, which is a topic which always comes up, for me, spent fuel is a big plus of nuclear power. Radiation is easily detected, way below levels that can cause harm. Spent fuel is solid and compact, and it contains all its waste in a small contained volume. Radiation fields continuously decline. And in fact, even spent fuel could be safely handled after a few centuries. At Chalk River, they're planning the near surface disposal facility for low-level waste, the biggest volume of which is demolition waste, but also waste from non-ACL and non-CNL sources, so it could be university and hospital waste. They are proposing to bury in situ WR1 and NPD reactors. And the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is undertaking the long process to select a volunteer community for their deep geological repository for spent fuel. So, are perceptions changing? I've been watching this industry and been part of it for a long time. I believe those perceptions are improving. And so I'd like to welcome you to the future while learning from the past. Thank you.